The voice didn't rise at first. It cut. "I want her out of my sight." Heads turned before anyone understood why. A glass paused halfway to a mouth. A seatbelt clicked somewhere too loud for such a quiet cabin. The first-class cabin of Flight 882 froze in that specific way people freeze when they know something is about to break, and they're standing too close to it. "I paid $10,000 for this seat," the man continued, now louder, now sure of himself. "I am not sitting next to her." The word "her" landed like a verdict. He was standing in the aisle, tall, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, dressed in a tailored navy blazer that still smelled faintly of cologne and entitlement. Richard Caldwell, 57, media executive, the kind of man whose name made assistants straighten their posture and lower their voices. He had not yet sat down. He didn't need to. He believed standing gave him leverage. The woman he was pointing at hadn't moved. She sat in seat 1B, upright, calm. Hands folded loosely over a thin leather folder resting on her lap. Her hair was pulled back in a neat, low bun. Cream-colored sweater, dark slacks. No jewelry except a simple watch. She looked like someone waiting at a courthouse, not someone being publicly singled out on a transatlantic flight. She adjusted her glasses, slowly, deliberately. The movement was small, but it carried weight. Then she went back to reading. That was when the temperature in the cabin changed. Richard noticed it before anyone else. He always did. He thrived on attention, on reaction, on the small fear he could usually smell when people realized who they were dealing with. But this time, the reaction wasn't fear. It was discomfort. Not at her. At him. "Sir," said a voice. Careful, trained, practiced. Beatrice Langley, the lead purser, stepped into the aisle. Mid-40s, 20 years in the air. Her smile was still in place, but it was thinner now, stretched tight over something like dread. She'd seen the name on the manifest. She had been hoping he'd sleep. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Richard didn't look at her at first. His eyes were locked on the woman in 1B. "Yes, there is. This passenger is occupying my space." The word "my" came out, sharp. "She's seated in her assigned seat, sir," Beatrice said. Her voice stayed level, but her shoulders were tense. "Seat 1B." "I didn't ask for a geography lesson," Richard snapped. "I asked for privacy. I asked for exclusivity. And I will not spend 7 hours listening to papers shuffle and someone breathe next to me." The woman turned the page. The sound was soft. Paper against paper. But in the silence, it echoed. A man in row 2 shifted uncomfortably. His wife's fingers tightened around her champagne flute. A younger passenger across the aisle stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, phone face down in his lap like a secret he wasn't ready to keep. Beatrice inhaled. "Sir, first class is a shared cabin. The overhead bins, the aisle, I do not share," Richard said. He finally looked at her now. His eyes were pale, cold. "Move her." There it was. Not a request, a command. Beatrice hesitated. That hesitation lasted less than a second. But Richard saw it. He always saw weakness. He leaned into it. I spend $500,000 a year with this airline, he said, louder now. Advertising, sponsorships, coverage. You know who I am. Yes, Mr. Caldwell, Beatrice said quietly. I do. Then fix this. The woman in 1B closed her folder. That sound was different, heavier. Leather meeting leather. Final. She looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were steady. Not defiant, not afraid. Curious, almost. Like a doctor studying a symptom. Sir, she said. Her voice was low, even, unhurried. American. East Coast. Educated without sounding polished. I paid for my seat. My bag is within regulation size. And I am not moving. Richard laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. It was short, barking, dismissive. The kind of laugh meant to put someone back in their place. You paid, he repeated. That's cute. Beatrice stiffened. Mr. Caldwell, or was this some kind of upgrade? Richard continued, ignoring her. A diversity thing. Charity seat? Because, let's be honest, you don't exactly fit the aesthetic. The word aesthetic slid through the cabin like a blade. The woman in 1B didn't flinch, but something shifted behind her eyes. Not anger. Focus, I suggest, she said. You take your seat so we can depart on time. Now the cabin was holding its breath. Richard stepped closer. Too close. His shadow fell across her lap, across the folder, across the small gold letters stamped near the edge. Federal Aviation Administration, Regulatory, Oversight Committee. He didn't notice. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? He said. Yes, she replied. The simplicity of it threw him. Just for a moment. Beatrice felt her pulse in her throat. She had dealt with drunk executives, entitled celebrities, people who thought a ticket bought them control. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. Not because of the woman. Because of the man who didn't know when to stop. Sir, Beatrice said again, firmer now. You're delaying boarding. If you don't sit down, I'll have to inform the captain. Go ahead, Richard said. He spread his arms, theatrical. Get him. I want him out. Out here. I want to look him in the eye when I tell him I'm pulling every contract I have with this airline. The woman exhaled, long, controlled, like someone choosing patience over instinct. She reached into her purse and placed her phone face down on the armrest. She didn't unlock it. She didn't call anyone. She simply sat back. I am ignoring your tantrum, she said. I'm reviewing safety audits for the transatlantic corridor. Pilot fatigue is up 4% this quarter. You're not helping. Richard's face flushed. Red crept up his neck. This was not how this went. People were supposed to shrink, apologize, move. He was about to speak again when the cockpit door opened. Captain Michael Harris stepped into the cabin. 52. Broad shoulders, calm eyes. The kind of presence that didn't need volume. He took in the scene in a single sweep. Richard standing. Beatrice tight with stress. The woman seated, composed, folder closed on her lap. What's going on? The captain asked. Richard pointed. This woman is refusing to move. She's aggressive. She's a security risk. I don't feel safe flying with her. The captain looked at the woman. She met his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't explain. She tapped the folder once with her index finger. Captain Harris blinked. Then his expression changed. Not slowly. Instantly. Color drained from his face. "Ma'am," he said, voice suddenly careful. Respectful. "Is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Captain," she replied. "Mr. Caldwell appears to believe he owns the aircraft." Richard scoffed. "I don't care who she is." Captain Harris turned to him. His voice dropped, hardened. "You should." The captain didn't raise his voice, but the silence after his words was heavier than shouting. "You should," he repeated. Richard Caldwell stared at him, searching for the familiar signs of deference. The subtle lean, the apologetic smile, the soft recalibration that always came when people realized who he was. He found none of it. Captain Michael Harris stood square in the aisle, shoulders set, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady. Not impressed. Not intimidated. "I don't fly with threats," the captain continued. "And I don't negotiate with passengers who interfere with my crew." Richard laughed again, louder this time, but it cracked at the edges. "This is unbelievable. I am the threat now. I'm the one being harassed." Behind him, someone cleared their throat. Another passenger shifted in their seat. A woman in the second row whispered something to her husband, her voice tight with unease. Phones stayed down, but attention sharpened. Everyone felt it. The point of no return. The woman in seat 1B watched it all without moving. She noted the way Richard's breathing had quickened, the way his hands clenched and unclenched like he was trying to hold on to something slipping. Power, she thought. The illusion of it. It always panicked when challenged. "Captain," Richard said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's be reasonable. I know the CEO of this airline personally. Richard Sloane. Played golf together at Augusta. If you don't resolve this, I will make sure you never command another international flight." Beatrice felt her stomach drop. She had heard that threat before, in different forms, from different mouths. It had worked more times than she liked to admit. Careers were fragile things in aviation. One complaint, one whisper, one call placed high enough. Captain Harris didn't look at her. He was watching the woman in 1B now, waiting. She stood. The movement was unhurried, but it shifted the entire geometry of the cabin. She rose to her full height, just slightly shorter than Richard, and faced him squarely, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Clean, subtle, expensive without trying. "My name is Evelyn Brooks," she said. Her voice carried, not because she raised it, but because it didn't need to compete. "I am not moving, and you are done speaking to the crew." Richard leaned in, invading her space. "You don't get to tell me what to do." She didn't step back. "You have one opportunity," she said quietly now. "Sit down, buckle your seatbelt, and remain silent for the rest of this flight." Her eyes held his. There was no anger in them, no threat, just certainty. Something in Richard recoiled. He didn't know why. He covered it with volume. Or what? He demanded. What are you going to do? Write me a memo. Captain Harris stepped forward. Sir, that's enough. Richard swung toward him. You remove her, or I will personally destroy your airline's reputation. That was when Evelyn reached for the folder. Not fast, not dramatic. She simply lifted it from the armrest and opened it to the first page. White paper, dense text, government letterhead, seals, signatures. Richard glanced at it by accident. Just a flicker. But the words registered before he could stop them. United States Federal Aviation Administration. International Regulatory Oversight. His mouth opened, ready with another insult, another dismissal. Captain Harris spoke first. Dr. Brooks, he said. The cabin inhaled. Beatrice's knees went weak. She grabbed the edge of a seat to steady herself. The name hit her like altitude sickness. She had seen it before. Briefings, emergency updates. The signature at the bottom of documents that grounded planes, rerouted fleets, ended arguments without discussion. Richard blinked. Once. Twice. Doctor? He said, incredulous. What is this? Some kind of joke? Evelyn closed the folder and held it at her side. I chair the International Aviation Safety Council, she said. I oversee compliance for carriers operating in US and European airspace. I review incident reports, crew conduct, passenger interference, and I make recommendations that determine whether an airline continues to fly. The words settled slowly, like ash. Richard shook his head. You're bluffing. I don't bluff. Captain Harris nodded. She's the authority, Mr. Caldwell. The last thread snapped. Richard's face drained of color. His bravado collapsed inward, leaving something raw and frantic behind. This is insane, he muttered. You can't do this to me. I didn't know. Ignorance, Evelyn said, is not a defense. It's a liability. She turned to the captain. He has verbally abused your crew. He has made threats regarding your employment. He has interfered with pre-flight operations. Under Federal Aviation Regulation 91.11. That constitutes unlawful interference. Captain Harris didn't hesitate. Agreed. Richard took a step back. Wait, let's slow down. We can resolve this. Evelyn met his eyes again. This time, there was something else there. Not cruelty. Not satisfaction. Indifference. You wanted me removed, she said. You wanted the cabin reshaped around your comfort. She paused. Let him feel it. I am recommending the opposite. Captain Harris turned to Beatrice. Call ground control. Richard lunged. He grabbed the armrest of seat 1A like it was an anchor. Number. I'm not going anywhere. Beatrice picked up the interphone. Her hand shook, but her voice didn't. Port Authority, we need assistance at gate. The sound of boots came fast. Too fast for Richard to adjust. 2 officers appeared at the aircraft door, uniforms crisp, expressions neutral. They scanned the scene in seconds. Sir, one of them said, already reaching for his cuffs, you need to come with us. Richard looked around the cabin. Faces stared back at him now. Not impressed, not afraid, recording, remembering. Evelyn sat back down. As they pulled Richard into the aisle, he twisted his head toward her. "This isn't over," he spat. "You hear me? I will bury you." She didn't look up from her papers. When the door closed behind him, the cabin exhaled as one. No applause, just relief. Beatrice wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. Evelyn glanced up at her. "You did your job," she said. "That matters." The plane began to taxi. 7 hours later, over the Atlantic, Evelyn Brooks looked out the window at the curve of the earth and knew with quiet certainty that Richard Caldwell would not forgive this. He would not reflect. He would retaliate. And for the first time, he would be fighting someone who did not need to raise her voice to end him. The walk back through the jet bridge felt longer than the flight itself. Richard Caldwell didn't speak. He couldn't. His jaw was locked so tight it ached, his breath shallow, chest rising in sharp, angry pulls. The Port Authority officers flanked him, polite but immovable, their hands light on his elbows in a way that made the message unmistakable. You are no longer in control. Passengers stared as he passed, not the admiring glances he was used to. These were different, curious, dissecting, some openly satisfied. A young man held his phone low but steady, the lens catching every step of Richard's humiliation. Richard noticed. He always noticed. And he memorized faces. Outside the terminal, the summer air hit him like an insult. Thick, wet, heavy with the smell of jet fuel and city grime. His driver, Frank, stood beside the black sedan, eyes widening just slightly before he looked away. Frank had driven him for 12 years. Frank had never seen him removed from anything. "We're not going to London," Richard said, as he climbed into the back seat. Frank nodded. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. As the car pulled onto the expressway, Richard finally exhaled. The silence inside the vehicle was brittle, vibrating with everything he wasn't saying. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone. Not fear. Adrenaline. The thrill of the counterattack beginning to form. He scrolled. Past politicians, past donors, past executives who owed him favors. He stopped at a name and hit call. "Preston," he said the moment the line connected. "Clear your desk." There was a pause, the sound of a chair scraping back. "What happened?" "I was kicked off a flight." Another pause. Then a low whistle. "That's new." "A woman," Richard continued. "Evelyn Brooks, some regulator. She pulled rank, humiliated me, in public." The silence on the other end stretched longer this time. "Brooks," Preston said slowly. "Dr. Evelyn Brooks." "Yes." "She's clean," Preston said. "Very clean." Richard smiled for the first time since the cabin door closed behind him. It was thin, sharp. No one is clean. By the time the car reached Manhattan, the plan was all ready unfolding. Not fully formed yet, but alive. Hungry. He would not win this by arguing facts. He would win it by shaping perception. He always had. Across the Atlantic, the cabin lights dimmed. Evelyn Brooks sat with her seat reclined just slightly, the hum of the engines steady and hypnotic. Outside, the sky was black, studded with cold white stars. She should have been tired. Instead, she felt alert, focused, the way she always felt when the stakes were real. She reread the same paragraph for the third time without absorbing it. Finally, she closed the folder and rested her hands in her lap. Across the aisle, a man pretended to sleep, one eye cracked just enough to watch her. 2 rows back, a woman whispered something to her companion, then stopped when Evelyn glanced up. Not paranoia, awareness. She had learned the difference early in her career. Beatrice passed by quietly, checking seat belts, her expression calmer now. When she reached Evelyn's row, she paused. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. Evelyn met her eyes. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes," Beatrice replied. "But I'm grateful anyway." The plane flew on. 7 hours later, the wheels touched down in London under a grey sky heavy with drizzle. As the aircraft taxied, phones came back to life one by one, screens lighting up the dim cabin like distant fires. Evelyn's phone vibrated once, then again. Then it wouldn't stop. She frowned and unlocked it. 47 missed calls, dozens of messages, notifications, stacked so tightly they blurred into one another. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with recognition. This was the sound of something moving fast. The first message was from her deputy in Washington. "Do not speak to press. Legal is convening now. Call me the moment you're off the plane." The second was from her daughter. "Mom, why are you trending?" Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. When the signal stabilized, she opened her browser. The headline filled the screen in bold letters. "Top aviation regulator accused of abuse of power after mid-flight meltdown." Below it, a grainy photo. Cropped, crooked, taken from the aisle. It showed Evelyn standing, finger raised mid-gesture, her face severe. Richard Caldwell was seated beneath her, eyes wide, mouth open, frozen in what looked like fear. The caption read, "Witnesses say Dr. Evelyn Brooks berated and threatened media executive Richard Caldwell moments before ordering his removal." Evelyn felt a chill settle in her chest. Not surprise. Confirmation. She scrolled. Anonymous sources. Selective quotes. Words like aggressive, unstable, overreach. The narrative was already hardening, congealing into something ugly and familiar. At the aircraft door, a uniformed ground agent waited, tension visible in the tight set of his jaw. "Dr. Brooks," he said, "we have a car ready. We thought it best to avoid the terminal." "Why?" she asked, though she already knew. "The press is outside." They took the stairs down to the tarmac. Rain misted the air, cool and sharp against her skin. Beyond the fence, camera flashes popped, rapid and hungry. Voices rose, overlapping, accusatory. "Did you threaten him? Are you resigning? Did race play a role in the incident?" Evelyn didn't look at them. She stepped into the waiting vehicle and closed the door behind her. The noise vanished instantly, replaced by silence and leather, and the soft hum of an engine. She was not alone. Richard Sloane sat across from her, shoulders slumped, tie loosened, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. The CEO of the airline looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single morning. "They're pulling ads," he said without preamble. "All of them. He's threatening to sue. 10 million. Emotional distress. Breach of contract." "He was removed for safety reasons," Evelyn said. "I know," Richard snapped, then sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know. But the board doesn't care. They care about stock. It's down 4% since the story broke." She watched the rain streak down the window. "So what are you asking me to do?" "They want an apology," he said quietly. "Public, from the airline. Distance ourselves. Say the crew overreacted under regulatory pressure." Evelyn turned to him then. Her gaze was steady, unyielding. "If you do that, you tell every pilot and flight attendant that their safety means less than a man's ego." Richard looked away. "He has a microphone. So do you," she replied. "You're just afraid to use it." The car moved through the city, tires hissing on wet pavement. London loomed outside, grey and indifferent. Richard swallowed. "He's going to destroy you." Evelyn's phone buzzed again. Another alert. Another headline. Another lie. She unlocked the screen and typed a single message. "We begin now." Somewhere in New York, Richard Caldwell watched his own story take shape on 6 glowing monitors and smiled, convinced the worst was behind him. He had no idea the storm had not yet reached him. The screens glowed blue in the darkness of Richard Caldwell's penthouse, 6 of them lined up like obedient soldiers, each feeding him a different angle of the same story. His story. He stood barefoot on cold marble, a glass of scotch hanging heavy in his hand, watching a news anchor with perfect teeth and a grave tone describe him as a respected business leader who had been publicly humiliated by an unelected bureaucrat. Richard smiled, slow, satisfied. "This is what power looks like," he murmured to the empty room. On one screen, social media scrolled endlessly. Hashtags climbed, clips looped. The same grainy image of Evelyn Brooks, finger raised, frozen in a moment, stripped of context and inflated with meaning. Commentators debated her tone, her demeanor, her fitness for leadership. The language was careful, coded, poisonous. He took a sip. The scotch burned just enough to feel earned. His phone buzzed on the counter behind him. He didn't turn right away. He liked the waiting, liked knowing someone was anxious on the other end. When he finally glanced down, the name made him chuckle. Laura. He let it ring twice more before answering. "What do you want? You're on every channel," she said. Her voice was tight, brittle. "What did you do?" "I defended myself. You attacked a federal regulator," I corrected her. There was a pause. He could picture her now, standing in that too-quiet house he'd bought and abandoned, one hand gripping the counter like she needed it to stay upright. "You're playing a dangerous game," Laura said. Richard laughed. "You always did overestimate consequences." He hung up before she could respond. Across the city, in a quieter building with fewer windows and thicker walls, Evelyn Brooks sat alone in a conference room, lit by a single overhead panel. It hummed faintly, an irritation she usually tuned out. Tonight, she noticed everything. A legal pad lay open in front of her, not filled with notes, just one line, written neatly at the top. "Assume escalation." She uncapped her pen and drew a line beneath it. Her phone rested face up this time. It buzzed again. Another message from her deputy. Another warning. Another request to stay silent. She ignored it. Instead, she scrolled back through the article that had started the morning. Slowly, methodically. She read every adjective, every unattributed quote, every strategic omission. This wasn't outrage. It was choreography. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She thought of the first time she'd testified before Congress, decades ago. Younger then, nervous, watched by men who smiled politely while planning to dismiss her. She remembered the feeling in her chest when she realized facts alone were not enough. That authority had to be worn like armor, and sometimes wielded like a blade. Her phone rang. A different number. She answered without greeting. "He's calling in favors," said the voice on the other end. "Male, calm, familiar. Old donors. Media partners. A few senators who owe him airtime." "I expected that," Evelyn replied. "He's also threatening the airline, pushing them to disavow you." "They won't," she said. "Not yet." Another pause. "You sound certain." "I am." She ended the call and stood, rolling her shoulders once, like an athlete before stepping back into the arena. The knock came softly at the door. Evelyn turned. "Come in." A woman stepped inside, early 50s, impeccably dressed, but carrying herself like someone used to being overlooked. Laura Caldwell met Evelyn's gaze and stopped just inside the room, as if unsure she was allowed to cross the threshold. "You called," Laura said. "I did." Laura folded her arms, defensive. "If this is about Richard, I can't help you." Evelyn studied her for a long moment. Not unkindly. Not impatient. She saw the tension in Laura's jaw, the faint tremor in her hands, the exhaustion of someone who had lived adjacent to power and paid the price for it. "I didn't ask you to help me," Evelyn said. "I asked you to help yourself." Laura scoffed. "That's generous." Evelyn picked up a folder from the table and slid it across. It was thinner than the one on the plane, heavier than it looked. "Do you remember the blue ledger?" Evelyn asked. Laura froze. The color drained from her face so fast it was almost imperceptible. Her fingers tightened against her sleeves. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, too quickly. "You do," Evelyn replied. "You mentioned it once, years ago, at a fundraiser in Aspen. You said if you ever needed protection, you kept copies." Laura stared at the folder, like it might bite her. "He said it was nothing," she whispered. "Just accounting. Logistics." Evelyn's voice softened, but it did not waver. "It's not nothing." Laura exhaled sharply, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. She sank into the chair opposite Evelyn, the fight draining out of her all at once. "He moves things," she said. "On the planes. Equipment. Servers. Cases that never get opened because they're press. He told me everyone does it." "Everyone doesn't," Evelyn said. Laura closed her eyes. "I kept the drive." Evelyn nodded. "I know." Silence stretched between them, thick with implication. Outside, the rain continued to fall, indifferent to reputations and empires. Back in the penthouse, Richard Caldwell refreshed his screen and frowned. The narrative was still his. But something had shifted. The tone in a few articles. The caution creeping into language that had been gleeful an hour earlier. A delay. A hesitation. He straightened, pulse quickening. He didn't like uncertainty. He reached for his phone again, already forming the next threat, the next call. At the same moment, Evelyn Brooks slid a flash drive across the table and said, "This doesn't end with a headline." Laura looked at her, eyes wet, searching. "What happens now?" Evelyn met her gaze. "Now," she said, "we let the sky close in." The first alert came while Richard Caldwell was still convinced he was winning. It was small, easy to miss. A polite email from his private bank flagged as informational, advising temporary review of several accounts due to routine compliance checks. He scoffed and deleted it without opening the attachment. Routine was what happened to other people. 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed again. This time, the screen stayed black for half a second longer than usual before unlocking. He frowned at the delay, irritation flickering across his face. He hated friction, any reminder that systems existed beyond his reach. Across the ocean, Evelyn Brooks sat in a secure office with no windows and very thick walls. The air smelled faintly of toner and old paper. She watched a small progress bar crawl across a monitor as files transferred from the encrypted drive Laura had handed over. Each percentage point ticked up slowly, deliberately, like a metronome counting down to something irreversible. "Chain of custody is clean," a man beside her said quietly. Late 40s. No tie, the kind of professional who never appeared on television. Metadata matches flight logs. Tail numbers align. Weight discrepancies are consistent. Evelyn nodded once. "Loop in Treasury. And Homeland, yes." He hesitated. "Once this goes live, there's no controlling the pace." Evelyn's mouth curved slightly. Not a smile. "Good." Back in New York, Richard stood at his kitchen island, phone pressed to his ear, pacing barefoot across marble that cost more per square foot than most people's homes. "No," he snapped. "You override it. That's what I pay you for." The voice on the other end was calm, almost apologetic. "Sir, this isn't a merchant block. It's a regulatory flag." "From who?" A pause. "Too long." "From the Office of Foreign Assets Control," the voice said. "Coordinated with UK Treasury." Richard stopped pacing. "That's not possible," he said. "That's for terrorists. Dictators." "Yes, sir." The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone, waiting for it to ring again, waiting for the correction that always came. It didn't. Instead, he opened his banking app. The screen loaded, then flashed an unfamiliar message. Access restricted. His breath hitched. Just once. He tried another account. Same message. His investment portfolio. Suspended. He dialed his CFO. Straight to voicemail. He dialed his attorney. Voicemail again. For the first time that day, something like fear cut through the adrenaline. In London, rain streaked the windows of the building, where Evelyn stood, looking down at a city that did not care who Richard Caldwell was. A secure line crackled to life behind her. Global grounding order issued, a voice said. Sterling Air Holdings. All tail numbers flagged. Certificates of airworthiness revoked pending investigation. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Not in relief, in acknowledgement. Notify air traffic control, she said. Any attempt to taxi becomes a violation. Yes, Doctor. In Manhattan, the lights flickered. Richard barely noticed. He was too busy tearing open a drawer, hands shaking now, pulling out a second phone. A burner. Old. Reliable. He dialed a number from memory. Richard, came the weary voice on the other end. It's late. I need a plane, Richard said. Now. A pause. The sound of breathing. You can't. I own 2 Gulf Streams, Richard snapped. Authorize a flight plan. Medical evacuation. Dubai. I can't authorize anything, the man said, voice tightening. The fleet is grounded. What? Every one of your aircraft. Global order. Signed. Richard felt his knees brush the edge of the counter as if the room had tilted. By who? Another pause. Shorter this time. He already knew. By Evelyn Brooks. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with everything Richard had dismissed, underestimated, laughed at. The call ended without ceremony. Outside, sirens began to rise. At first, he told himself they were distant. Someone else's problem. The city was full of noise, but the sound grew louder, closer. He moved toward the window, heart pounding now, no longer pretending it was anger. Below, the street bloomed with red and blue light. Black vans screeched to a halt at the curb. Men poured out. Tactical vests, purposeful movements. No hesitation. Richard backed away from the glass, pulse roaring in his ears. His mind raced through options that no longer existed. Safe deposit boxes, offshore accounts, names that suddenly felt flimsy, paper-thin. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Caldwell," came the doorman's voice, shaking. "Police." The word landed like a verdict. In the hallway outside his penthouse, boots thundered, commands barked, metal struck wood. Once, twice, Richard stood frozen in the center of his living room, surrounded by art he no longer saw, money that no longer mattered. The door splintered inward. "Federal agents!" a voice shouted. Hands, where we can see them." Rough hands grabbed his arms, twisted them behind his back. Cold metal closed around his wrists. The sensation was shocking in its intimacy. He gasped, the sound sharp and undignified. They dragged him through the wreckage of his doorway, into the elevator, down past floors he had never bothered to learn the numbers of. Outside, cameras flashed. Not his cameras, not his terms. As they shoved him into the back of a van, Richard caught sight of a figure across the street. A woman under a black umbrella, rain sliding off its edge in thin silver lines. She stood still, watching. Evelyn Brooks did not wave. She did not smile. She simply looked at him the way she had on the plane, with certainty. Inside the van, as the doors slammed shut and darkness closed in, Richard felt his burner phone vibrate in his pocket. He fumbled, cuffed hands awkward, finally managing to glimpse the screen. One message. "Seat 1A is available again. But I don't believe you can afford the ticket." The siren wailed, long and final, carrying him away as the city returned to its business, and the sky above closed without mercy. The news cycle devoured him by morning. Richard Caldwell's arrest rolled across screens with the same hunger that had once amplified his voice. Anchors spoke carefully now, choosing words like alleged and developing, but the images did the work for them. The shattered penthouse door, the van, the cuffs, his face caught in an unguarded second of disbelief. The man who had once dictated tone now existed inside it, reduced to a clip that looped without mercy. In a quiet office miles away, Evelyn Brooks watched none of it. She sat at a long table with binders arranged in precise rows, listening as attorneys spoke in measured cadence about warrants, jurisdictions, cooperating agencies. She asked questions only when clarity demanded it. Dates, chain of custody, airworthiness revocations. The law was a machine. She respected machines that worked. Public reaction is volatile, someone said. Support is rising, but there's still noise. There will always be noise, Evelyn replied. Proceed. The first hearing came quickly, too quickly for Richard to assemble a story that could save him. He sat at the defense table in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, hands folded, shoulders drawn inward. The courtroom smelled faintly of disinfectant and old wood. Cameras were barred inside, but sketches traveled fast. Artists captured his hollowed cheeks, the way his eyes darted toward the door as if expecting rescue. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The charges were read: fraud, smuggling, conspiracy, endangerment of aircraft operations. Each count landed with a dull thud that echoed in Richard's chest. He stared at the table, jaw tight, telling himself this was temporary. Everything was temporary, if you knew how to wait. The prosecution called its first witness, an engineer, middle-aged, soft-spoken. He explained weight tolerances like someone reciting a bedtime story, his words gentle and devastating. Discrepancies, repeated, documented, hidden beneath exemptions that trusted press equipment without question. He did not look at Richard when he spoke. He did not need to. Then a pilot. He described takeoffs that felt wrong, landings that strained, a constant unease he had learned to silence because the manifests said everything was fine. He admitted the truth with eyes fixed on the floor. He had trusted the paperwork. He had trusted the system. The defense objected, often, loudly. The judge overruled, patiently. When Evelyn Brooks was called, the room changed. She walked to the stand without hurry, grey suit crisp, posture exact. She did not look at Richard as she sat. She placed her hands on the rail and waited for the oath, voice steady as she affirmed it. The prosecutor began simply. Name, title, scope of authority. Evelyn answered without embellishment. She did not say power. She said responsibility. When asked about the flight, she described facts. No adjectives, no commentary. She quoted regulation numbers from memory. 91.11. Crew interference. Passenger removal protocols. Safety first. Always. The defense rose, eager now. Aggressive. Dr. Brooks, the attorney said, isn't it true you took this incident personally? No, Evelyn replied. Isn't it true you felt insulted? I felt concerned. Concerned enough to target my client? I applied to the law. The attorney paced. You expect this court to believe this was not retaliation? Evelyn met his gaze. I expect this court to believe in gravity. At altitude, it applies to everyone equally. On the ground, so does accountability. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge rapped her gavel once. Silence returned. Richard watched her then. Really watched. He saw no triumph in her expression. No satisfaction. Only resolve. It unsettled him more than anger ever could. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like days to him and minutes to everyone else. When they returned, the foreperson's voice did not waver. Guilty. On every count. The sound that left Richard's throat was small, almost childlike. It surprised him. He had not known he could make that sound. The judge leaned forward, glasses low on her nose. She spoke not as an adversary, but as an observer who had seen this story before. You believed influence excused conduct. You believed wealth insulated risk. You were wrong. The sentence followed. 12 years. The courtroom exhaled. In the weeks that followed, the empire collapsed with clinical efficiency. Assets liquidated. Boards resigned. Papers that once praised him now printed his downfall with forensic enthusiasm. The machines he had fed turned on him without sentiment. Evelyn Brooks returned to work. She reviewed new safety standards, approved revised training protocols. She signed orders that would outlast her tenure. She did not give interviews. She did not write a book. Her silence was not avoidance. It was discipline. 6 months later, the visitation room smelled of bleach and quiet despair. Richard sat on a plastic chair bolted to the floor, thinner now, hair dull, eyes ringed with exhaustion. He had learned the rhythms of the place. Count, wait, eat. Count again. The days were indistinguishable. That was their cruelty. The door opened. Evelyn Brooks stepped inside. He looked up, disbelieving, then bitter. You came to gloat? I came to conclude, she said. They sat across from each other, glass between them. Phones lifted. The connection crackled. I had a life, Richard said, voice hoarse. I mattered. You still matter, Evelyn replied. Just not the way you thought. She slid a small envelope across the counter. Inside, a boarding pass. Faded. Preserved. Seat 1A. Richard laughed then, a sound scraped raw by regret. You ruined me over a seat. Evelyn shook her head. You ruined yourself over what you believed a seat meant. The guard signaled time. As she stood to leave, Richard pressed the phone to the glass. You think you won? Evelyn paused. She did not turn back. This was never a game. Outside, the sky was low and grey, the kind of day that promised nothing and delivered exactly that. Evelyn walked away, coat buttoned against the cold, carrying no trophies, only the quiet knowledge that some laws, once enforced, restore more than order. They restore air. The prison yard was silent, in the way only controlled places could be, quiet enforced by routine rather than peace. Richard Caldwell learned that silence quickly. Morning count, metal doors, the smell of boiled eggs and disinfectant. Conversations that stopped when guards passed. He moved through it all like a ghost of a man who used to take up space without permission. Here, space was assigned. Time was rationed. Names were replaced with numbers. He was inmate 8940. The first weeks were the worst, not because of danger, because of irrelevance. No one asked what he did. No one cared who he had been. His reputation, once loud enough to bend rooms, meant nothing inside concrete walls. Power did not echo here. He sat alone most days, staring at the same patch of chipped paint, replaying the flight in his mind like a scratched record. The moment he stood in the aisle, the certainty in his voice, the look on her face when she didn't move. That look haunted him. Not anger, not fear. Something colder, like gravity asserting itself. Across the ocean, life moved forward. Evelyn Brooks stood at a podium in a quiet briefing room, the seal of the Aviation Council behind her. She spoke about revised safety enforcement, about closing loopholes long ignored. She spoke about accountability and systems built on trust. Her voice was steady, unadorned. Reporters asked about Richard Caldwell. She redirected. "This is not about an individual," she said. "It's about standards." When asked how it felt to take down a powerful man, she paused, just long enough to make the room lean in. "I didn't take anyone down," she said. "I stood still while the law caught up." The question died there. Weeks passed, then months. Richard's appeals failed quietly. His lawyers stopped visiting as often. The letters from former allies dried up entirely. Even the anger faded, replaced by something heavier. Understanding, not acceptance, but awareness. One afternoon, during a routine library shift, a younger inmate sat across from him. Thin, curious, unimpressed. "You really that guy?" the man asked. Richard didn't answer. "The plain guy," the man continued. "The rich one?" Richard nodded once. The man studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Thought you'd be bigger." That night, Richard lay awake on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the penthouse, the screens, the feeling of being untouchable. He thought of how small the distance had been between that world and this one. A seat, a sentence, a signature. He wondered when it had slipped away from him. Not the money, the restraint. In Washington, Evelyn reviewed a final report and signed her name at the bottom with the same pen she had used on hundreds of others. The ink dried. The file was closed. Another system corrected. Another risk reduced. Her work was never done. That was the point. She declined invitations, declined accolades. She spent evenings walking quiet streets, unnoticed, content with anonymity. Power, she had learned, was safest when it did not need witnesses. On the anniversary of Flight 882, she received a letter. Handwritten. Careful. The paper was cheap, the handwriting unfamiliar. She read it once, then again. It was not an apology. It was not a plea. It was an acknowledgement. Sparse, uncomfortable, honest in its own limited way. I thought the world bent to me. I learned it doesn't. You were right. Evelyn folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She did not respond. Some lessons were not meant to be completed, only learned. That evening, she stood by a window and watched planes cut white lines across the darkening sky. Thousands of people moving at once, trusting systems they never thought about, trusting that someone, somewhere, had held the line. She turned away from the glass and went back to her work, the quiet hum of responsibility filling the room, steady and unyielding as the world continued to fly. The courtroom was quieter the second time, not because the stakes were lower, because the spectacle was gone. Richard Caldwell stood again before the bench, thinner now, his suit hanging awkwardly on a frame that no longer carried itself with certainty. The gallery was half full. No cameras, no commentators whispering into headsets. Just clerks, guards, a few reporters scribbling out of habit rather than hunger. This hearing wasn't about guilt. That had already been decided. This was about forfeiture. The government's attorney spoke calmly, efficiently, as if reciting inventory rather than dismantling a life. Properties listed by address, not nickname. Accounts by number, not prestige. Aircraft by tail designation, not bragging rights. 2 Gulf Streams, 1 long-range business jet. Seized, liquidated. Proceeds redirected. Richard listened, jaw set, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles blanched. Each item felt like a nail being pulled out of the structure that once held him upright. Not the loss of luxury, the loss of narrative. He was no longer a man who owned things. He was a case file being closed. The judge nodded along, occasionally asking for clarification. The process was meticulous, boring, unforgiving. At the back of the room, Evelyn Brooks sat quietly. Not as a witness, not as a defendant, as an observer. She had not planned to attend, but the clerk had informed her the hearing was public. Closure, she knew, was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was procedural. Richard noticed her halfway through. It startled him more than the verdict ever had. She looked the same, composed, neutral, as if time had passed around her instead of through her. For a moment, he felt the old instinct surge, the urge to perform, to reclaim relevance by confrontation. He suppressed it. There was no stage left. The judge's gavel fell. All assets enumerated are hereby forfeited. The words echoed briefly, then vanished into the room's dull acoustics. Richard was led away without resistance. No outburst, no threats, just the soft clink of restraints and the shuffle of shoes across tile. Evelyn did not follow him out. She waited until the room emptied, then stood and collected her coat. As she turned toward the door, the prosecutor caught her eye. "Dr. Brooks," he said, "this case will be cited for years." She nodded once. Then it will have served its purpose. Outside, the city moved with indifferent efficiency. Traffic lights changed. People hurried past without looking up. A newsstand displayed fresh headlines, already chasing the next outrage. Evelyn walked 2 blocks before her phone rang. "Yes," she said. The international carriers have accepted the revised protocols, the voice reported. Full compliance. No objections. Good, Evelyn replied, and the union representatives wanted me to pass along their thanks. Evelyn paused, watching a plane ascend in the distance, its engines cutting clean lines through the air. Tell them they did the work, she said. I just enforced it. She ended the call and continued walking. Back inside the prison, Richard sat on his bunk, staring at the envelope he had been handed after the hearing. Inside were copies of the final orders. Official, unemotional, complete. He read them slowly, then folded them with care he hadn't shown to anything in years. That night, as the lights dimmed, another inmate spoke from the neighboring bunk. They took everything. Richard nodded in the dark. The man whistled softly. Damn. Richard said nothing. There was nothing left to add. Days later, a box arrived in Evelyn's office. Plain cardboard. No return address. Inside was a single item, a model airplane, cheap plastic, the kind sold in airport gift shops. On the underside of the wing, written in careful block letters, were 4 words. Seat 1A. Lesson learned. Evelyn held it for a moment, then placed it on a shelf among thick binders and framed certificates. It did not stand out. That, she thought, was appropriate. Time passed. The Aviation Council released its annual report. Incidents of crew interference declined. Training standards tightened. Oversight became routine rather than reactive. The world adjusted. Richard Caldwell became a footnote, a cautionary example cited in law reviews and compliance seminars. His name lost its heat, then its relevance. Younger executives skimmed past it, certain they would be smarter, certain they would stop in time. Some would. Some wouldn't. On a quiet evening, Evelyn returned home later than usual. She poured a glass of water, stood by the window, and watched the sky darken. Planes crossed overhead, lights blinking in disciplined formation. She thought of all the hands that made that order possible. Pilots, mechanics, controllers, regulators. People who did their jobs without applause. She turned away from the window and switched off the light. The sky remained open. The letter arrived without warning, folded once, sealed with tape that had been pressed down too hard. Richard Caldwell stared at it for a long time before opening it. Mail was rare now. Mostly legal notices. Mostly silence. This envelope was different. No letterhead, no lawyer, no threat seen through the fog of formality. Inside was a single page. Parole review scheduled. Attendance required. He read it twice, then a third time. His hands were steady. That surprised him more than the words. The hearing room was smaller than the courtroom had been. Fewer people, less ceremony. A table, 3 officials, a guard near the door, a digital clock on the wall ticking louder than it should have. Richard sat alone. He wore the same grey uniform as everyone else. No tailoring, no polish. Just fabric and seams, and the faint smell of institutional detergent. His hair had thinned further. His face had changed shape, not from age alone, but from the absence of control. One of the officials glanced at the file. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you've served a portion of your sentence. This review assesses rehabilitation accountability, and risk. Richard nodded. He had practiced this moment in his head 100 times. Each version sounded wrong. "Do you accept responsibility for your actions?" another official asked. "Yes," Richard said. The word came out plain. Not defensive, not dramatic. The woman looked up. "Explain." He hesitated, not because he lacked words, because he had too many. "I believed rules were suggestions," he said finally. "That money translated into permission. I treated people as obstacles instead of equals." The official watched him closely. "And now?" Richard exhaled slowly. "Now I understand that power without restraint is just noise." The clock ticked on. Across the city, Evelyn Brooks sat in a quiet cafe near the river, a folder open beside her coffee. She was not thinking about Richard Caldwell, not consciously. Her mind was on a different problem, a proposed route expansion, environmental impact, pilot training thresholds. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then set it face down without answering. Back in the hearing room, the questions continued. Routine. Predictable. The board members conferred in low voices. Finally, the chairwoman cleared her throat. "This review does not erase your sentence," she said, "but it may alter its conditions." Richard listened without expectation. "Parole denied at this time," she concluded. "However, continued behavior of this nature will be noted for future consideration." Richard nodded once. He did not argue. He did not plead. He stood when instructed and followed the guard out. As the door closed behind him, he felt something unfamiliar. Not disappointment. Not relief. Acceptance. That night, back in his cell, Richard lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. He thought of the question he had been asked. Responsibility. Accountability. Risk. He thought of the flight again, of how small the moment had been. A seat, an assumption, a choice made without thought. He understood now that the fall had not begun with his arrest. It had begun long before, with a pattern of treating others as less than human. He closed his eyes. In another part of the city, Evelyn finished her coffee and stood. Outside, the evening air was cool, the sky streaked with the last light of day. She walked along the river, hands in her coat pockets, unrecognized and unbothered. She thought briefly of the parole notice she had declined to read earlier. Not because she feared it, because it was no longer her concern. Justice, she knew, was not personal. It was structural. Once set in motion, it did not require her attention to continue. A plane passed overhead, low and steady, its lights blinking against the darkening sky. She paused, watching it disappear beyond the buildings. Somewhere inside that aircraft, people sat in assigned seats, trusting a system they would never see. Trusting that someone, somewhere, had done the work quietly and correctly. Evelyn resumed walking. Back in the prison, lights dimmed. Doors locked. The day ended the same way it always did. Richard Caldwell turned on his side, facing the wall. For the first time in years, there was no plan forming in his mind. No strategy, no counterattack. Only the long, unbroken stretch of consequences ahead, and the understanding that some flights, once missed, could never be rebooked. The morning came quietly, without ceremony, the way endings usually do. Evelyn Brooks stood in the terminal of a small regional airport, not the kind with marble floors or private lounges. Just rows of molded plastic seats, the smell of burnt coffee, the low murmur of ordinary lives in transit. She held a single carry-on, no entourage, no assistants. Her reflection in the glass looked like any other traveler waiting to board. The announcement crackled overhead. Boarding would begin shortly. She watched people line up, a retired couple arguing gently about seat numbers, a businessman tapping his phone with restless impatience, a young woman holding a sleeping child, shifting her weight to keep the kid comfortable. None of them knew her. None of them needed to. That was the point. Power, she had learned, was not about being seen. It was about what held when no one was watching. Somewhere thousands of miles away, Richard Caldwell woke to the sound of keys and footsteps, the same sound that had marked every morning for months. He swung his legs off the bunk, feet touching cold concrete. He followed routine without resistance now. Shower, count, breakfast, silence. He no longer replayed the hearing, or the trial, or the flight. Those memories had dulled into something less sharp, less accusatory. They existed now as facts rather than wounds. In the common area, a television played quietly. Morning news. A segment about aviation safety reforms scrolled across the screen. New training standards, reduced incidents, improved compliance. No names mentioned. Richard watched for a moment, then looked away. He understood, finally, that the story had moved on without him. That was its mercy. Back in the terminal, Evelyn stepped forward as boarding began. She handed over her pass. The gate agent smiled politely, scanned it, and waved her through. "Seat 12C," the agent said. Evelyn nodded and walked down the jet bridge. The aircraft was smaller than the one she'd been on that day, but the sounds were familiar. The hum of systems waking up, the soft thud of bags settling into overhead bins. She found her seat, slid in, buckled the belt, and placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her. Outside the window, the sky was clear. As passengers settled, a man across the aisle struggled with his carry-on. He grunted, muttered under his breath. Evelyn stood, lifted the bag easily, and stowed it for him. "Thank you," he said, surprised. She smiled once and sat back down. The plane pushed back from the gate. Engines spooled. The familiar forward pull pressed her gently into the seat. As the aircraft lifted, Evelyn felt the subtle shift, the moment when ground released its hold and trust took over. She closed her eyes briefly, listening to the steady rhythm of flight. This was why she had chosen the work. Not for authority, not for recognition, for this quiet normalcy, for the invisible systems that allowed strangers to move safely through the sky. At cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dimmed. Conversations resumed. Life continued. Evelyn opened a folder and reviewed notes for her next meeting. A new route proposal, environmental constraints, risk assessments. There would always be more work. That was not a burden. It was a responsibility. She thought, fleetingly, of the boarding pass she had kept all this time. Seat 1A, not as a trophy, as a reminder, not of a man who fell, but of a line that held. The plane flew on, indifferent to past drama, carrying people forward as it always did. And somewhere between the clouds and the earth, the lesson remained, steady and unavoidable. Status does not grant immunity. Money does not replace restraint. The rules that keep us safe matter most when someone insists they do not apply. When the wheels touched down, Evelyn gathered her things and stood with the rest of the passengers, waiting patiently for the aisle to clear. No rush, no entitlement, just movement, shared and orderly. She stepped into the terminal and disappeared into the flow of people, exactly where she belonged. If this story stayed with you, let it travel further. Tap like, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment with these 3 words. Tell your story.